Good afternoon. My name is John Strope. Welcome to History Nebraska's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in the Old Father Family Auditorium here at the Nebraska History Museum in downtown Lincoln. Learn more about History Nebraska and our programs and services at history.nebraska.gov. If you are not a member of History Nebraska, I encourage you to join. Your support allows us to provide programs like the Brown Bag Lecture Series free for all Nebraskans. For a full list of membership benefits, visit our website. Special thanks to the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs across the state. We'd also like to thank LNK-TV, a service of the City of Lincoln, which produces these programs. If you would like to watch previous Brown Bag lectures, visit the History Nebraska YouTube page at youtube.com/History Nebraska and see a section called Playlists, and you'll find, I think we're close to 180 on there now. Our topic today is NU at 150, 12 events that shaped the University of Nebraska. Our speaker is Kay Logan-Peters. Kay is Professor of Libraries at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she serves as the Art and Architecture Librarian. She has spent over 2 decades researching the history, buildings, people, and events that define our university. In 2017, Logan-Peters authored the University of Nebraska-Lincoln book. She also maintains a website devoted to the architectural history of UNL. Go to historicbuildings.unl.edu. A proud alumna, Logan-Peters holds a BA in English and Art History from Nebraska and an MA in Library and Information Science from the University of Missouri. Just to let you know about asking questions, Kay invites you to wait until the end unless you are just dying to ask. Please join me in welcoming Kay Logan-Peters.
Thank you, John. I should also mention you can buy my book, The University of Nebraska, out here in the bookstore. I just saw it on their shelves. Well, it's a privilege and an honor to come and speak to you about this today. I talk about this a lot. I think about this a lot. It's always fun to have a captive audience and people that want to hear about it. This is kind of a no-brainer, but it was a very important step. So the first thing I selected, I should point out too, these are the 12 most important events according to Kay Logan-Peters. This is not an official statement, and I'm not speaking for the university in any kind of official capacity, but some of these are pretty straightforward, and this is one. The passage of the Morrill Act of 1862. At Chancellor Ronnie Green's speech on Tuesday, in his State of the University address, he talked about how important the Morrill Act was to the state, how important it was as a piece of legislation. It was a new and bold idea because it opened education to people of the working classes. Education was primarily for wealthier white men. And prior to this, or it was affiliated with a religious institution. But the Morrill Act, from the very beginning, allowed women to attend, and it was designed to build educational skills and knowledge among the working people of the United States who needed these skills to go forward and make our state successful. It was geared to farmers. The agricultural mission was a large part of the Morrill Act. This is a photo of one of our former deans of agriculture at a test field. in his younger years. So it was developed to improve agricultural education, really create agricultural education, which didn't exist prior to this. It was geared to improve the mechanic arts. That's part of the Morrill Act statement, which we now call engineering. There was a component of military science, and at the University of Nebraska, our military science program at one point was commanded by John J. Pershing. This is why so many things in Lincoln are named for Pershing. He was here as a young man in the 1890s, and he's the very dapper guy right there in the middle. I love this picture. And it also created the Extension Service, the Land Grant Act did, the Extension Service and experiment stations, which came a little later, but were an important part of that. And women, of course, women. These are women in a domestic science class in the 1890s. We now know that it later became home economics. I'll say it that way. Okay, my second choice. Chartering of the university. This is even more of a no-brainer, but it was very important. When the state was very new and the capital was brand new, it was relocated to Lincoln. And then 2 years later, the legislature chartered the university and located it here in Lincoln. So the location was extremely important to the development of the university and to the development of the city of Lincoln. It created some conflict. I don't think this is a new story. There were many factions competing for all of these new state departments. The legislature was so committed to the growth of Lincoln, which was really just a few thousand people, that they not only put the Capitol here, they put the state penitentiary here, they put the state asylum here, and they put the University of Nebraska here, which is a source of all kinds of humor. So the university was located here when Lincoln looked like this, not much. And it really did help the city grow and prosper. The first building, the only building, the university, was opened in 1871. And this building has taken on legendary proportions because it was such a failure as a building. It cost $128,000, but the legislature had allocated $100,000. So the state building committee that had been created by the governor at that time, David Butler, went ahead and approved the extra $28,000. Ultimately, this cost them a lot of political pain and agony, and eventually Butler was impeached. Thank you. Slight memory lapse there. He was impeached partially because of this incident with University Hall. So what exactly was wrong with this building? Well, it had a bad foundation. Made of sandstone that sort of disintegrated before the building was completed. It was constructed with materials that weren't available locally at that time. The railroad wasn't here yet. Everything had to be dragged into town in wagons. The bricks were made locally. They weren't very high quality brick. It had many issues, and these issues went on for decades and decades until the university finally took the building down. But the real problem with this building was that it gave the Omaha and Nebraska City newspapers, who were still sore about losing the university and having the university located here and the capital, it gave them fodder for their arguments that the university should be closed. Should just shut it down, and we don't need it yet anyway. The state isn't ready for a university, these kind of arguments. And then move it to my city. So that went on for many years, and it was kind of an uphill struggle. The other thing the charter provided was that the existence of a farm. Because of the land grant mission, we needed a farm presence. The first farm was located where Nebraska Innovation Campus is now, and then the fairgrounds at one time. But that land was not very good agricultural land. So in 1874, the Board of Regents selected a farm at 33rd and O. It was a working farm, and they bought it from a farmer named Moses Culver. The placement of the farm is important too. It was out in the country. It was a long drive out there. At the time, they selected it, but it was a significant step. Here's a page from the Omaha Bee as late as 1881. I don't know how clear that is. You can read that. About this bill from a senator named Mullen, who was trying to move the university to Omaha. And this went on up until the university campus grew a little bit. By 1890, this idea of moving the university had kind of died down, but it was not unusual for incidents like this to happen. J. Sterling Morton really wanted to close it down in the 1870s and move everything to Nebraska City during one of the previous building crises. Eventually, University Hall was reduced and looked like this at the end of its years on campus, and this is probably close to the time of demolition in 1945. This is an example of how the enrollment was growing during these years. It's impressive. Okay, number 3, the arrival of Charles Bessey. I don't think it's possible to overstate the impact and importance of Charles Bessey to the 19th century campus. He was a professor at Iowa State, and the university contacted him and offered him a job doing basically what he was doing there, and he said no thank you. So they contacted him again, not much later, and offered him a deanship, offered him a position as dean of the industrial college, and that tempted him. So he arrived in Lincoln in 1884. I think Bessey was a skilled administrator. He didn't want to be chancellor, even though he was acting chancellor a few times. But I think he was, it's hard to overstate his impact. Here he's pictured with several students, and the older woman in the front row was Ellen Smith, a faculty member for whom Ellen Smith Hall is named. And Lawrence Bruner is standing next to Bessey. Bessey's the older gentleman with the beard, not that old. the gentleman with the beard in the back on the left. And Bruner is the person on his left. And I like this picture because it shows Bessey pictured with students. I think he was an approachable person. The university at this point would have been like a high school with a few hundred students. And Bessey would have known almost all of them. One thing Bessey did was mentor really important people that became very important in the scientific world. And I think that, according to Robert Knoll, that was his biggest contribution to the university. And there are so many, it's hard to pick his biggest contribution. In this photo, he's pictured with students that were in the Seminar Botanicum, which was a science club. And in the back row there you see Roscoe Pound on the far left. We all know Roscoe Pound he's he's in our Nebraska Hall of Fame. He went on to become dean of the Harvard Law School. But while he graduated in 1888, Pound did, and then studied law for a year at Harvard, where he learned about football. And then he came back to Nebraska, passed the bar. He was 20, passed the bar, opened a law practice, and while he was building his law practice, he completed a PhD in botany with Bessey. So, and this, not everybody was Roscoe Pound. Roscoe Pound was kind of a prodigy, but Bessey mentored many people that went on to have great scientific careers. The fellow next to Bessey became president of the University of Maryland. The fellow with the dark hair on the second from the right is Frederick Clements. Frederick Clements married a young woman who also studied at the university named Edith Schwartz. She was the first woman to earn her PhD at the University of Nebraska. She studied with Bessey. Clements studied with Bessey. Bessey authored a book with Pound. And it goes on and on. This is just a little snapshot of a group in the 1890s. That's Bruner seated there next to Bessey. Bruner was such a prodigy that he became a faculty member and didn't ever finish his degree. He was interested in insects. He was a farm boy. His father was a very early regent, and I think his parents indulged this kind of brainy kid they had. He came to the university and studied, but honestly, he knew more about entomology than anybody here. So he eventually became a faculty member, and then he has his own tree of scholars that follow him. So Bessey was brilliant in that respect. One thing Bessey did while he was here was reorganize the Industrial College. And the Industrial College was the university's answer to our sort of land grant directive to provide education in agriculture and mechanic arts. Nobody was taking classes in agriculture. Farmers didn't think that that was necessary. They thought that their sons would learn farming better by working. And so agriculture was getting off to kind of a limping start. We had the farm, but the farm was very undeveloped at this point. So the Industrial College enrollment was very low, and this was one of the many sources of criticism directed at the university, was that the Industrial College wasn't really doing its job. It wasn't really providing farmers much benefit, and it wasn't growing. So Bessey reorganized the Industrial College so that all science was moved into the Industrial College, and every student had to take a certain amount of science. So suddenly the enrollment in the Industrial College jumped because all these core courses were added to the ag and engineering courses. This building is Old Nebraska Hall. We have a Nebraska Hall now where our engineering programs are located, the old Elgin Watch building, as we call it, down on 17th and Y. But this building was up in the original campus between 10th and 12th and R Street and T Street. That was it. That's all we had. And Bessey participated in the construction of this building. He didn't build it, but he was around when it was built a few years after he got here. I think after the success of the Industrial College was a little more assured. Here's another photo of it. Bessey designed the cornerstone, and I think it really sums up his work ethic and his thoughts on scientific education. And I don't know if you can read that. It says science with practice. And he was a practical person. When he taught his students, he sat with them in the lab. He didn't lecture very much. He was more of a hands-on instructor, what we now call experiential education. He just did because he thought it worked best. Lab work was kind of a new idea too, and Bessey really promoted that. So he was very important. This photo was taken when the building was being demolished, and this is Chancellor Hardin many years later, in the late 1950s. Bessey also worked very hard to improve things out at the farm. The farm was yet another source of criticism because it was kind of wild and unkempt. There was really nobody out there doing much with it until the late 1880s. And I think at Bessey's urging, they hired a farm manager who kind of cleaned it up and tried to do some simple farming. Eventually, this man was hired. His name was Senator Kay Perrin. He was not a senator. His name was Senator. And he, it was Senator W. Perrin, not Kay. And he took over the management of the farm in 1889 and raised his family there and became kind of an institution at the farm. But he and Bessey worked very closely. He would bring the wagon from the farm downtown, pick up the mail, pick up Bessey, take him back to the farm, and they would talk about improvements out of the farm. Eventually, Bessey, in the 1890s, authored, along with some other academics, the Hatch Act, which is a piece of legislation that worked in tandem with the Land Grant Act to develop the agriculture experiment stations. And every institution got $15,000 a year for agricultural experimentation. Bessey kind of saved that money, and he built the experiment station building, which was really the first major building on East Campus. There were other buildings, there were barns, and there was a very simple dairy building and a house that the Perrin family lived in. But the experiment station was the first building that was really an academic building. And it's still there. It's the oldest building on East Campus. So the next time you get ice cream, and you're standing at the south end of the East Campus Mall, it's the first building over on the east side of the mall. It's a great old building. Finally, the last thing that Bessey did was he hired Edgar Burnett. And Burnett came to the university in 1899, I believe, and stayed for many years and eventually became chancellor. He had a very successful run at the farm. It really was transformed under Burnett and Bessey's leadership from a farm that kind of had an identity problem into a campus where agriculture courses were taught. And that's just a great picture of some students at the School of Ag. The university in its early years had a prep school, a preparatory school, which was called the Latin School. And when students from rural Nebraska came to Lincoln to study, if they weren't prepared for college-level courses, they took courses in the Latin School. Sometimes, Willa Cather, I think, spent a year there. Sometimes students would take a couple of years of coursework there. Thomas Rogers Kimball, who's about to enter our Hall of Fame, took a year there at the Latin School on city campus. But Bessey and Burnett opened a similar school on East Campus, and it was called the School of Ag. And these are boys in the School of Ag who were maybe 15, 16-year-old kids. It wasn't a preparatory school for college. It was a preparatory school for farming. It was a way to kind of learn a little bit more before you went back and helped your dad on the farm. This barn fell down, unfortunately. The old barns on East Campus were really pretty remarkable, these huge timber buildings. Eventually, the mall on East Campus took shape, and this is what it looked like probably around 1910. Of course, Bessey's other big contribution was the Nebraska National Forest at Halsey. He was interested in learning whether or not the sandhills would be valuable as ag land. I think now we know that that probably isn't a very good idea, but then, he was trying to help the state develop. And here he is at his very messy desk towards the end of his career here. One of the things Bessey did, he was acting chancellor twice. The first time he was acting chancellor for quite a while. And in the third year of his acting chancellorship, he approached the regents and said, you have to find somebody else to do this job or I'm going to leave. So they asked him who they should hire, and he recommended James Canfield, who I've chosen as my number 4 major event, was the hiring of James Canfield and the marketing of the university. Canfield was at KU. He was a history professor at Kansas. Bessey and Charles Geer, who was chairman of the Board of Regents at that time. Geer was always a huge supporter of the university. We really should have a plaque or a building or something on campus in honoring Geer, because he was a real champion for the university during these kind of difficult first 2 decades. So he and Gere went to Kansas City. They interviewed Canfield. Canfield came to Lincoln, and he went back to Kansas, and within a few days he wrote and said, okay, I'll take the job. But the campus had some issues, and he went out of his way to correct some of those. But I think his real achievement was that he left Lincoln. He traveled, according to him, he traveled 10,000 miles a year, selling the university to the people of Nebraska. So he was a one-man marketing department, and he was a really energetic and enthusiastic person. He was still relatively young at this time. He went out, and there's no group he wouldn't talk to. He talked to ladies' aid societies. He talked to school teachers. He really felt like the university was an extension of the public school system, and that students would naturally, they'd go to elementary school, they'd go to high school, they'd go to the University of Nebraska, just move through the ranks. And so he worked with a lot of teaching groups and schools. He met with farmers and farmers groups. And he really extended our reach out into the state and had a really pretty profound impact on building support for the university. The university was finally turning a corner and coming out of the era where Omaha and Nebraska City were trying to shut us down. And we had good faculty coming to the university because of Bessey. Bessey was also great at getting talented faculty to join the university community. One of the things that Canfield noticed was that our campus didn't look very good. Our campus was still one building in a kind of ratty-looking, weedy prairie. So the summer he got here, the iron fence, the old iron fence that surrounded campus in these years was constructed, and construction on the library started shortly after that. And the university library was, and still is there, it was a special project of his because he wanted to make sure it was a quality building, because the university had added a few buildings since University Hall, but they were only slightly better than University Hall, kind of questionable building materials and things like that, or just not maybe very well planned. So when the library was constructed, Canfield took great interest in making sure it was done right. And honestly, it's the only building left from this early era. It's now the oldest building on campus and is known as Architecture Hall. Here's a photo from, this would have been taken after Canfield had left. Canfield was here until 1895. But this gives you an idea of some of the landscaping efforts, and campus looking a little more civilized. Actually, it looks really nice in this photo. This image was probably taken from the tower on University Hall. Canfield was also very approachable. Students loved him. But one thing in particular that he did was sort of empower young female students. There were a lot of women students in these years, but they were very constrained in terms of what they could do and clubs they could belong to and events they could attend. It was typical that you needed an escort to go to a lecture or a concert, and he told them, just don't do that. Just, hang around with each other, be friends to each other. The woman in the front row right in front of Chancellor Canfield is Willa Cather. She was well acquainted with his family. He had a daughter who was at a very impressionable age, Dorothy Canfield Fisher, who went on to become a very well-known novelist in sort of the 30s and 40s. But she would have been a maybe 13, 14-year-old girl in these years, and I think he supported women. He was an early feminist. He also supported women's athletics. But the other thing Canfield did was supported football. He knew that it built state pride and a connection to the university. People out in western Nebraska might not ever come to Lincoln, but they would read about the football games. They supported the football team. They showed the scarlet and cream colors, even though those weren't the official colors yet. But he reported that everywhere he went, the scarlet and cream was displayed. Those colors were officially adopted closer to 1900, but apparently they were already sort of adopted by the rest of the state. We have some scarlet and cream represented here today. Okay, we're going to jump ahead quite a bit. In 1914, this is a photo of what campus looked like around 1910 to 1914. It was full. Our little 4 city blocks were built up to the point that there was not much, there was absolutely no place to squeeze in another building unless they put something right in kind of the center of campus in what was kind of like the park-like, the sort of garden area that they didn't want to build on. So there was a lengthy debate about how the campus could grow. Everybody knew that the university was out of room. As early as probably the 1890s, Bessey had floated the idea that maybe campus should just pack up and move to East Campus, consolidate everything at East Campus. Bessey eventually, I think he probably had to sell this idea for a decade or so, but eventually Chancellor Avery, who was the relatively new chancellor at this time, Avery and many other faculty supported it. It wasn't universally endorsed, but it was endorsed by university administration. The legislature was sort of grappling with how to address it. And this image shows you just how tightly packed these buildings were. In 1908, they jumped north of T Street and built what was called Nebraska Field. That was actually the second football field. The first football field was located where that kind of large building in the northwest corner is, which we now call Richards Hall. That was the original field where the football players are in that photo I just showed you. So they jumped T Street, but it was very piecemeal. So the legislature knew this was a problem. Eventually, the legislature is still a House and a Senate. The House supports removing the university from downtown and consolidating on East Campus. The Senate, of course, didn't. So the university is left kind of in limbo, but the legislature did allocate funding for a building program for 8 years of building, but they had to figure out where the building would occur. So Chancellor Avery worked with a well-known established architecture firm from Boston called Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, and they were well known as campus designers and campus planners. They'd done Stanford and the University of Chicago. So he hired them to develop plans for various scenarios. A consolidated East Campus city, a consolidation of both campuses on the farm campus, or an expanded city campus. So the legislature is still struggling with this issue, and the House and the Senate can't agree. When the next session comes along in 1913, they have passed the legislation that allowed for referendums and petition drives, which we still use all the time. And so they decided to put the issue of campus removal on a referendum. They passed it around a petition. They got everything ready, and they made it a referendum issue. So it would go to a statewide vote. This seems like a crazy way to run a university, but this is how it happened. So here's the East Campus consolidation. So the downtown merchants in Lincoln were terrified by the prospect of losing their student customers. We had boarding houses and barber shops and lunchrooms and everything that supports a good-sized number of students. And by this point, the student population is probably about 2,500 people. So they hired a publicity company. The university didn't do that. The publicity people ran ads all over the state to vote down the referendum. And there were a lot of arguments for why that it was a waste of money. There were buildings on the city campus that were built, and what would become of those buildings. And in truth, all of those buildings could have been repurposed. The university or the downtown probably would have grown onto the campus area pretty quickly and filled in. But these people didn't want to lose their livelihoods. So by the time the referendum rolled around, it was defeated like 3-1. So at least the university at that point, they didn't really like the way the vote went, but they knew where they stood. So they had the money that had been allocated for this growing the university legislation, and they expanded to the east, and that was when they purchased the property from 12th Street over to 14th Street. Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge stayed on as architects, and they designed a collection of buildings on the city and East Campus. The chief one was this is what we now call Louise Pound Hall, and for a while we called CBA, or the College of Business Administration. At this time it was called Social Sciences Hall. Some of these buildings have many, many names. And this is right across from Sheldon Gallery at 12th and R. So this was one of several, and it was the new gateway to the new university. It was sort of the big statement building. And on East Campus, they built Chase Hall at the north end of the mall, and it was also kind of a grand-looking structure. So the relocation, I'm going to quit talking for just 10 seconds and let you ponder what Lincoln would be like had this referendum passed, and what University Place would look like, probably more than downtown. The changes would have been pretty profound. Okay, World War I rolls around, and it changed campus almost overnight. Now, World War I was controversial even right up until the time we entered the war. We entered the war in April of 1917. And most of campus supports the war, but like all groups of people, there was never total agreement. And there were faculty who had voiced opposition to the war before the declaration of war. They became sort of targets of a lot of scrutiny. Lincoln, of course, had J.J. Pershing, who they considered sort of one of their own. So most of Nebraska was supportive of the war. And in fact, shortly after the declaration of war, the Social Sciences Hall, which wasn't even completed yet, became sort of a giant dormitory for the Student Army Training Corps. And this is a picture of Pershing after the war in the 1930s, after he had retired, with a group of soldiers. But our connection to Pershing, who is now in charge of the whole World War I European effort, was pretty strong. The governor of Nebraska created a council called let's see if I can get this right, Council on Defense, or Strategic Council on Defense, or something like that. Thank you. So the purpose of this council was to build loyalty and support for the war effort. Now, up until World War I, Germans in Nebraska were a significant group. Lots of Nebraskans have German heritage, and they were a respected group. And suddenly, that's not the case. We had many faculty that had ties to German institutions. Our chancellor got his PhD at the University of Heidelberg in chemistry. Louise Pound had attended, gotten her PhD in Germany. We had German language programs, we had German operas, we had, there was just a lot of interest in German culture, not necessarily support of the Kaiser or the war, but interest in German culture. So, and there were pacifists, there were people on campus that just didn't want to be involved in a war. So the governor's council had a subcommittee that was charged with monitoring loyalty and patriotism. And it was a statewide committee, but it focused on the university and as this hotbed of German sympathizers. And really it was a very small number of people who had made some not very serious remarks about why are we in this war kind of remarks. I'll make this as painless as possible, but it's a painful story, so it's kind of hard to do that. After a year of rumors and division among the faculty and questions about who was for and who was against the war and finger pointing, about a dozen university people were selected to face what amounted to a deposition, I guess you'd call it. The regents, this council had been trying to push the regents to do this, and the regents really sort of resisted it. But eventually they decided, we'll just talk to these people, we'll have these hearings, and we'll get this over with and find out what's going on and maybe calm down this conversation. So the hearings were held in the former law school. They were sort of legalistic. The regents hired somebody to kind of be the questioner. And it was a very, very stressful time. And I think it divided the faculty in ways that were not very productive. Some faculty testified against other faculty, and the unpleasantness surrounding this incident is really sad. One of the young women that was questioned was working with the Alumni Association, which was fairly new then. Her name was Annis Chaikin. She ended up marrying a classmate named Sorensen, and she was Ted Sorensen's mother. Ted Sorensen, our native Nebraskan who worked for JFK as a speechwriter. And there were others. By the time the dust settled, 3 faculty members were identified as people who needed to be, whose ties to the university needed to be severed. One of them was a pacifist. He wouldn't give to the fund drives for the war. He instead gave his money to the Red Cross. His departure seemed particularly unfair, and the other 2 were probably a little more bold in their statements. There were 2 faculty who were particularly guilty of finger pointing and stirring the pot, and the regents also severed ties with those 2. They didn't fire them, but they put them on administrative leave, and eventually they were both allowed to return. And one of them was Fred Morrow Fling, who was a longstanding faculty member and stayed with the university for many more years. But it was not a good chapter in the history of the university, and I think there was a lesson in all of it. The other thing the war brought was a flu epidemic, and the influenza at UNL, or at Nebraska, was compounded by the fact that all these soldiers were living together in Social Sciences Hall. And there were also students living on East Campus in various buildings. So, they didn't let them quit their drilling, and nobody thought of separating them. So the university ended up with little infirmaries and buildings and houses all over the campus area. I think there were 8 altogether, and campus was actually shut down for several weeks in October of 1918, just before the end of the war. And this is when talk of a student health service finally took on some momentum. although we didn't actually build a student health until the 1950s. But we had a student health later on, before we actually built one. Okay, Chancellor Burnett took over, this is number 7. Chancellor Burnett took over the university as chancellor in 1927 or 8. He was acting chancellor for a while. In 1929, we have the market crash, and the state economy and every other economy went to pieces. So Chancellor Burnett had been very successful on East Campus, and he'd had a pretty good run out there. Almost the minute he took over the whole institution, his job changed, and not in an especially pleasant way. But through his contacts with other university presidents and chancellors, he got wind of the concept of a university foundation, an independent fundraising branch that could help the university meet its needs when the state wouldn't, or was, for whatever reason, unable to fund the university. And the university, like all state institutions, wanted more than the state could pay for. So one of his good friends and earliest donors was Donnell Love. There were other earlier donors, but Love was the first really major donor. So he donated a couple of dormitories, and here Burnett and Love are together at the groundbreaking of Love Memorial Hall, which was a dormitory on East Campus named in honor of Love's wife, Julia. And then eventually, when Love died, he left a bequest to the university, which funded the university library, Love Library, just down the street. I think the importance of the foundation is can't be understated. It got off to a little bit of a slow start. It was actually formally created in 1936, but it didn't even have a director until the early 40s. But it was slow and steady until by the 1970s and 80s, they were raising real money. And now, of course, they're a huge enterprise that that support great building projects and scholarships and endowed professorships and named professorships and all kinds of good things. Eventually, the University Foundation was taken over by D.B. Varner, who was president of the university in the 70s. Varner was great with people. He was a great fundraiser, and he really moved the foundation to a higher level. And then, of course, he was succeeded by Terry Fairfield in the 80s, 90s, and 2000. And Terry worked miracles at the foundation as well. So I think that's a significant thing. Every institution, every state university has something like a foundation to supplement their income. The GI Bill and the post-war boom, number 8. The war, obviously, was a huge game changer on campus, but that happened everywhere, and I kind of chose the post-war years because they had such an impact on our campus. This particular photo shows temporary buildings that are being built on the green space that was on the north side of Love Library at that time. This gives you an idea of what happened to the enrollment during these years. The campus almost doubled, really in the course of a summer. And the university knew this would happen, but it's like bracing yourself for a hurricane. No matter how tightly you hold on, you can't you can't anticipate the force of that storm. So the impact on campus was huge. There was a lot of pressure on. These are dormitories that were constructed kind of as a result. They weren't built till the 50s. This is Selleck, but the impetus for these dorms occurred because of this wave of soldiers that came in. More temporary buildings. The pressure on faculty was great. Their classes suddenly, doubled and tripled in size. Their teaching loads increased. There weren't enough classrooms. The classrooms were too full. And we didn't have services for veterans until this time that have continued since then, things like student health and Veterans Affairs, services for veterans. We have a very strong program in that now. But campus was literally bursting. And we'd been through this very, very dry period where we weren't building things and our infrastructure was just not quite ready for the onslaught. One of the things we didn't have was parking. We had no parking, not a parking lot. Streets still went through campus and you could park along the street, but we probably had, 10 times more cars than we had street parking. So all these veterans, they were grown men, they showed up with their cars and they couldn't park. And at one point, it resulted in a parking riot. This is a picture of a parking riot that actually occurred in about 1948. So we also started building parking lots after the World War boom. The other thing we started building was married student housing. These were people with families and adult problems and adult lives, and so that was the appearance of married student housing was around this time. Okay. We can't deny that when Bob Devaney showed up, football became a totally different creature. People in Lincoln loved football, and people throughout the state always supported our team. But once Devaney came, our football program took on a life of its own, and we all remember that, right? When the Devaney years and how much people loved football and still do. Chancellor Hardin came from Michigan State, where Devaney had worked prior to going to Wyoming. Tippy Dye was our athletic director at that time, and together, mostly I think on Hardin's part, they knew that they needed to do something with football. Hardin thought it would bring in revenue and improve our relationship with the state. I mean, he was very pragmatic about it. And so he called Doherty, the coach at Michigan State, and Doherty said, I don't want to come to Lincoln, but you should call Devaney, he's in Wyoming. And Hardin said, well, will he come? And Doherty said, well, he will if I tell him to. So they smuggled Devaney into town. There was great interest in this. They smuggled him in, and he took the job, and the rest is history. I think a great way to illustrate this is the stadium in the late 1950s. This is the press box. I find that just positively terrifying. And this is what we have now. It's not all Bob. It was also Tom Osborne and national championships and things like that. But I think there's no denying that football brings in money, not just to campus, but to Lincoln, and is an important part of our cultural heritage in Nebraska. Okay, then the baby boomers showed up, number 9. And with the baby boom came a building boom. Campus changed a lot during these years. If we go back to our enrollment numbers, during the decade of the 60s, enrollment doubled. Chancellor Hardin, who saw an enormous and oversaw an enormous amount of change in the 50s and 60s when he was here, knew that we had to improve student housing. We had very little housing. We had the Women's Residence Hall, which had about 600 rooms, and we had Selleck for men, which is probably slightly bigger. I gotta hurry up here. So we built Cather Pound, and then we built Abel Sandoz, and then we built Harper Schramm Smith. And then women students started wondering why there was this elaborate set of rules that applied to them that didn't apply to male students. The women had hours, they couldn't have keys, they had curfews, they had all kinds of rules. And by the middle of the 60s, this generation was questioning everything. And that was one of the things Chancellor Hardin had to deal with, was parents saw the university as sort of in loco parentis. Students didn't see it that way anymore. Students thought of themselves as adults and wanted to make these decisions. The civil rights movement, which swept across the country in the early 60s and mid-60s, hit campus in the late 60s. And this particular group was called the Afro-American Collegiate Society. It was a national organization. They demonstrated, they had a peaceful demonstration at the admin building demanding more representation among faculty and courses and things like that. And of course, we had the whole anti-war movement. We all remember this, if we're old enough. That's what this young woman is holding. That's what the poster in the center of this says. So there were a lot of things happening on campus that were not like anything that had happened before. Lots of new buildings, lots of new income, but also lots of students with big ideas. We had a student strike. The faculty supported it. That was following the Kent State situation. Old customs like Ivy Day with its pageants and queens and pages and kind of went away. We still have Ivy Day, which we use for tapping new members of Innocence Society and Mortarboard, but this kind of pageantry and interclass competitions and things disappeared. Norbert Tiemann was a great friend to the university in the late 60s. And I believe in 1967, the regents asked for nearly double the allocation. We had a new system of taxation, and we just needed more money to run this much bigger campus with a lot more students. And Tiemann didn't support doubling the university's allocation, but he requested a 40% increase, and that happened 2 years in 67 and 69. So the university finally could sort of catch up and keep up, as they called it in those days. He, of course, was defeated in the 1970 election, but he was a great friend to the university, both financially, but also because he was a friend to students. I got to talk fast here about the merger. I think the merger is probably the single biggest event that changed the university. And it was a quickly done deal put together by Terrible Terry Carpenter from Scottsbluff. He was sort of the Ernie Chambers of his day in that he kept the legislature on its toes. But the merger really forced the university to think much more broadly and become part of a system. And so, of course, now we're a multi-part system. At this time, Varner Hall was created for the university president. We now call it was Regents Hall then, now Varner Hall. And then we brought in UNK, here's Woody Varner. And then finally, we joined the Big Ten, which I think is a really significant change for us. I think a lot of people view it as an athletic department, or as an athletic maneuver only, but really the impact to academic programs has also been impacted pretty significantly, especially in the libraries where I work. We rise to the level of the company we keep. Some of the institutions in the Big Ten are the greatest libraries, among the best academic libraries in the country. So I think I'll stop there. I think I have about 10 seconds left. Thank you.